Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the NJ podcast. This podcast aims to share stories, tips, and insights about achieving success while having fun. From topics ranging from personal development to business, entertainment, and sports, the podcast will have conversations with experts and people in their respective fields. The podcast will also share insights from Jablo James's published and upcoming books. The tagline, which is the theme of the podcast, is "Success is a progressive realization of a worthy ideal." This means that you are doing what you have always wanted to do because it is aligned with your highest values, and this is the only way you can live a truly fulfilled life. Your host, Jablo James. All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, this is Jablo James, the host of the NJ podcast, where we talk with people from all walks of life, because I honestly believe, I don't care where it is you come from, you all have a story to share and a message to tell. And the theme of the podcast is "Success is the progressive realization of worthy ideal." That means you're going after what you've always wanted to go after because it's in alignment with your highest values. And that is the only way for you to live a truly fulfilled and a successful life. And on the show today, I have a very courageous, strong, and interesting lady, woman. Her name is Sandy Kirkham, aka Strong Woman. That's the nickname that I've given her. And she's here to share her story around being able to survive abuse, especially in the Christian context, in the church context, and how we can overcome that. And the theme of this episode is going to be being able to confront the truth of what happened and be able to speak out against it, so that your story can inspire millions of others. And I'm going to read out her bio. So, a church is where as an insecure 16-year-old girl should feel welcome, happy, and most importantly, safe. Tragically, for some, the church can become a place of great harm. Sandy Phillips Kirkham experienced the deceit and lies that come with being the victim of a wolf in sheep's clothing, her church's youth minister. Yay! That's a bit tough. Now, after decades of keeping her deep secret, Sandy discovered her voice and has made it her life's work to be an advocate for others. Sandy continues to use her voice to help victims of clergy abuse. She is a highly requested speaker, podcast guest, and media liaison on the topic. Sandy has spoken before the Ohio Senate, a Maryland court, and appeared on a local television show in Boston. Her story, Stolen Innocence, was told in a documentary produced by the Hope of Survivors. Sandy works with survivors, conducting victim support conferences. She has participated on panels moderated by SNAP, Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priests, sharing her perspective from a non-Catholic point of view. Sandy Phillips Kirkham, aka Strong Woman, thank you very much for joining me on the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you very much. So, outside the bio, could you just give a brief synopsis of who you are, where you come from, and why it is that you are here today?
My name's Sandy Phillips Kirkham, and I am from Cincinnati, Ohio. I've lived here all my life. I'm married with 2 grown children and 2 perfect granddaughters and 2 fairly well-behaved dogs. I have been working with victims of clergy abuse for about 15 years. And it's been my joy and my sorrow as well to do this kind of work.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you said it's your joy and your sorrow. How is it a joyful experience, and how is it a sorrowful experience?
Well, one of the things that I've often thought over the years was, what if I had heard someone's story when I was being sexually abused by my youth pastor? Because at the time, I thought I was the only one. I didn't think this was happening to anyone else. So I've often wondered how my life would have changed had I heard someone else's story. And maybe it would have given me the courage back then instead of waiting 27 years to come forward. And so my joy is when I discover that my story has an impact on another victim, and my story can give courage and hope to another victim. And the sorrowful part, of course, is that so many times and so often I meet a victim whose life has been destroyed by clergy sexual abuse, and they have found themselves so disconnected from the church and God. And it just breaks my heart to know that this continues even so many years after my own abuse.
So this is a question. So when was the first time that this abuse happened, and like how did it start? I mean,
Well, first of all, I was very active in the church. I started attending when I was a young child with my best friend who invited me to go. And I loved everything about church. It was a place I found such joy and peace. My parents were divorced. I didn't see my father much. So I had some emotional instability in my life. I had good parents, but I didn't get the attention that I thought I needed. And so the church provided for me that place where I was loved by the people in the church and the congregation. I taught Sunday school. I sang in the choir. If the doors of the church were open, I was there. I was baptized when I was 13, and my faith deepened after that. Shortly after I turned 16, our church hired a new youth pastor, and he came with these great ideas. He was very different than any pastor we'd seen. He was charismatic. He kind of dressed the way the young kids dressed. He knew our music. He drove a convertible. I mean, in the vernacular of 70s, he was hip.
He was hip.
He was hip.
And
he
it.
just, and he just had a persona about him, and people were just drawn to him, and everyone wanted to please him. They wanted to be a part of this growing phenomenon that he had. So very early on, he chose about 5 of us to be his core leaders, but he really zeroed in on me and made it very clear that I was one of the leaders, and I needed to make sure I did everything that he had asked and I wanted to please him. And I certainly, and like the attention that I was getting from this. And I felt that I was helping the church and I was pleasing God by doing this work. But one night after a youth group meeting that was held in my home, he waited for everyone to leave. He walked over to me, told me how much he appreciated me, how much he cared for me, how much he loved me. And then he really was thankful for all the work I had been doing in the church. And then he just bent down and he kissed me. And I was stunned. I didn't know how to react. I thought, what is he doing? But then I thought, well, this is my pastor. He wouldn't be doing anything he shouldn't be doing. And this is a person that everyone loves in the church. So I kind of just thought maybe I misunderstood. And then I kind of rationalized it by thinking, well, this is just his way of showing how much he appreciates me. And it was really the only way my 16-year-old mind could rationalize it. Throughout that following year, I babysat in his home, and he would come home when his wife wasn't there, and he would sit and talk about the Bible, or we'd talk about the church. And none of that really seemed out of line to me because he was my pastor. And sometimes he kissed me when he took me home. Sometimes he didn't. So it was a very subtle and very determined kind of way to start breaking down the boundaries and getting me to accept this behavior, to a point that finally one night he had sex with me. And from that point on, it changed everything, because while I could rationalize the kissing, I knew this was wrong, but I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't know who I was going to tell. He made me promise not to tell anyone. He made it clear that if I did, no one was going to believe me. And honestly, I couldn't believe this was happening to me.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I felt this obligation that I had given my virginity to this person. And in the church that I grew up in, that was something, once you did that, you were committed to that person. And then he started I use the term gaslighting, telling me things like this was ordained in God's eyes. We were married in God's eyes. He was just like David in the Bible. And so in order for me to function in this dysfunctional relationship, I was accepting that because I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't tell anyone. I felt like I was in a black hole with no way out. And the abuse lasted for 5 years. It went on for 5 years.
That's a long time, until you were
a very
21.
long time.
Yeah.
And during that time, in the beginning, he was very kind. He was loving in some respects, but it quickly turned very dark soon after he had sex with me. And he became controlling as to who I could see, how I was to dress,
oh my goodness,
where I could go. He was violent. He hit me.
So it felt like he owned you.
Yes, exactly. And so, and I didn't see it any way out. I just assumed that this was going to be my life. I didn't think I'd ever get married. I didn't think I'd ever have children. In my mind, this would only end when he said it was over.
Jeez, that's so amazing. I started reading and started watching on documentaries that we were talking before the conversation, that sometimes the females or whoever it is that's being abused will not feel that it's their fault. They'll feel that it was something that was supposed to happen. So for those who have been preyed upon, who feel that it's their fault, how do they break themselves out of that mindset? I mean, because this is something, you're young, you don't know any better, person is of high authority, and now it's
Right.
even more complicated because now there's the element of a higher power, so that's sort of involved
Right.
now. Now your entire identity is wrapped up in this. Now you don't. Now you think that it's your fault, not the other person's fault. So how do you break out of that mindset? Because it can be very toxic, I think.
Right. And I just assumed that I must have done something to encourage him, because why else would he do this? This is not
Yeah.
something so I did feel a lot of guilt and shame, and felt like there was something I had done. And I thought I should have been able to say no. But,
Mm.
people need to understand, when you're in a vulnerable emotional position, your coping skills are not what they would be if you were not in that position. And these men target vulnerable people. They don't go
Uh,
after someone who's strong enough to say no. And
yeah.
and again, they start very subtly. So they keep pushing the boundaries enough to see how far they can go. And they've already, especially in my case, he had created a dependency on him,
Mm.
because he was helping with, the fact that I didn't see my father. I looked at him as a
Yeah.
father figure. He was giving me these positions in the church, that in leadership, that made me feel good. So there's this, such a confusing part. And so when I say to victims is, the first thing you need to understand, that it is not your fault. You were targeted. You were taken advantage of by someone you should have been able to trust in the safest place on earth. And so therefore, you didn't have the ability to say no to this person who was in authority over you. Now, that's a difficult concept for victims to accept. And it took me a long time, because I kept saying to myself, but I should have done something. I should have done something. And in the position I was, I didn't have that ability to do anything. And once he crossed that line of having sex with me, I was totally trapped. I didn't see
Mm.
a way out. The second thing I tell victims is, you need to educate yourself. You
Yeah.
need to understand the terms grooming, manipulation, and gaslighting, because all of those
Mm.
things were used on you to trap you. And
Yeah.
so once you understand those terms and understand what really
Mm.
did happen to you, the ability to accept the fact that this was someone who should have never done what they did to you is
Yeah.
much easier.
So, Sandy, like this, can we just zero in on those three terms,
Mhm.
especially gaslighting, because it's been in my conscience for quite a while. I also started because I was training in neurolinguistic programming, and then I came across a book that talks about dark techniques of NLP, and they do talk about gaslighting. You also mentioned grooming. What was the other one?
And manipulation.
And manipulation. So can we start with what is gaslighting, and how do we
Well,
defend ourselves against it?
gaslighting is a manipulative term psychologically, where the
Mm.
abuser begins to change your perception of reality. So
Mm.
when you might think something isn't right, your abuser is telling you, no, it's okay, it's fine. So they start using terms like, well, you don't know what you're talking about, or I never said that, or no one's going to believe you. When you think, well, somebody might, no one's going to believe you. And they repeat this over and over. So to a point where your ability to see your reality as it really
Yeah.
is it's impossible, because now you're seeing the reality through what your abuser wants you to see.
Mm.
So so for instance, my abuser would tell me over and over, no one's going to love you like I can, and that no one's
Oh
ever going to
wow.
love you again because you're not a virgin. Well,
Yeah.
I began to believe that. And so
Mm.
I truly, that's what gaslighting does. And it's a slow, manipulative process. And when you question them, they'll say things like, well, you don't know what you're talking about, or
Mm.
why do you think you're smarter than I am?
Mm.
So you become to be berated to a point where you do then accept whatever that abuser wants you to see.
So in essence, gaslighting is a technique where the person who's abusing you makes you feel that you're being crazy
Exactly.
by understanding the truth.
Right.
Yeah.
That's exactly and that is the goal of gaslighting, is to make you feel like you can't trust your own judgment, and you can't
Mm.
question him, because there is no questioning someone who's already made you feel like you're not smart enough to question me.
Mm. Jeez, that's madness. And then you talk about grooming. What's that about?
Grooming is to establish an emotional connection with the victim. So that's usually the first step of these perpetrators. And again, they look for vulnerable people. They look for people that they know they can manipulate and groom. And what that means is they set this emotional a connection so that you are dependent upon them. And they tell you how wonderful you are and how great you are. And they make you feel good. And people who, again, are in an emotional instability crave attention. And so this attention only makes them feel better. And then they begin to trust this person. And what happens is they start to push the boundaries of acceptable behavior. So what you wouldn't accept in some behavior in someone else, you may accept in this person because they have now set you up to this point of trusting them beyond what you normally would trust someone. So for instance, I babysat for this family. Well, he would wait till the wife left, and then he would sit and talk to me about the Bible. We would spend hours talking after the kids were in bed. Well, if this had been my 30-year-old neighbor down the street, and he wanted to sit and talk with me all evening about whatever, I would have gone home to my mom and said, okay, this is weird. This guy doesn't take me home after babysitting. He wants to sit and talk to me all evening.
Yeah,
what interest?
Wrong.
Yeah. What interest would I have? But because he was my pastor, he used that as a way to say, this is normal, that we're going to talk about the Bible. I'm going to give you books to read on how to help your spiritual life. That he normalized inappropriate behavior. That's what grooming does.
Okay. I see. And then you talk about manipulation. Although I see all these three being interlinked, but I see they also have their place.
They all, in fact, all three of them are intertwined, and they're used at different times in the abusive relationship. So manipulation is creating situations in order to control that person. So, in my case, he would say, I'd like you to come and help do something at the church. Well, it wouldn't be something I normally would have done, but he was asking me to do it just so he could be around me. They manipulate people and situations. And keep in mind, in a clergy situation, they're not only grooming, manipulating, and gaslighting the victim, they're also doing that with the congregation, because they do need to make everyone else around them feel safe, and they need to have everyone else believe that whatever they're doing is okay. And so congregations don't question the pastor. Again, if it were a neighbor down the street, they might say, I don't know why he spends so much time with her. But when it's the pastor, they saw it as a good thing. Well, he's helping her. So those are so it's grooming, manipulation, and gaslighting. And I encourage not only victims, but I encourage church leadership to understand that terminology, because if you don't understand how these perpetrators work, you're not going to be able to identify them when they are in your midst.
Yeah, 100%. So
and they're there. They are there.
Yes.
I mean, I mentioned this before, but the Bible mentions 27 times about wolves in sheep's clothing. We're warned 27 times. So churches should not be surprised that these men find themselves in these places, because anywhere there are vulnerable people, whether it's Boy Scouts, the gymnasts in Michigan, these are where these predators find themselves. They want to find people who are involved. And the churches are full of vulnerable people because they come to the church for help.
So that makes it difficult. So then with everything that you've gone through from a clergy perspective, church perspective, how is it that do you have any faith whatsoever in the churches that are running now? Or is it very difficult for you to go back into? Because I mean, for myself, when I saw nefarious things happening in the church that I was involved in, and I was like, I'm going to be very careful about just the church in general. I mean, I've seen cases where TV ministers will come in and ask their congregation for $54 million just so they can go spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm like, can't you just put out YouTube videos for free if you want to do that? And people fall for this and they give out their entire income, and then they harm the congregation who have so much faith in them. And then now that these issues where there's sexual abuse and predatory behaviors and going through what you've gone through, did that destroy your faith completely in the church, or did you rebuild it?
Yeah. So let me say two things. One, this isn't about pastor bashing. This is about education. It's about trying to prevent future abuses. So I know that there are pastors out there who are very faithful to their calling, but there are a lot that are not. And that's why we have to have this conversation. The second thing I need to add, I think, is once his actions were discovered, he was called in by the elders. He was told he was sorry. I'm not sure what narrative he gave or what he told them, but they took a vote to see if they could continue to keep him as the minister, but it was decided that he would move to the next church. He was given a going away party with gifts, and he was moved to the next church. Shortly after his departure, I was called in by the elders and told that because of my behavior, I was to leave the church and that I was no longer fit to worship in that church. And I was devastated. That church was my whole life. I loved everything about that church. So when you ask that question, yes, because I've often said the response of the church and how they handled me as a victim probably had more of a lifelong effect on me than the actual abuse did. So
I get that. Yeah.
Church for me, so for 27 years, I kept this secret. My husband didn't know. My friends didn't know. I did go to church because I wanted my children to have that experience, but I could never engage in church in any way. I never listened to the sermon. I would block out any prayers. It was a huge trigger factor for me.
Yes, of course.
Once I was able to finally tell my secret, church was not it was easier, but the trigger factors were still there. So I would say that I haven't lost my faith in God, but church is difficult for me. It gets easier at times. I was someone who carried my Bible to school with me every day. I prayed every day. I had devotions. I didn't pray for 27 years. So once I began to understand what was done to me and that this wasn't God's fault, this was a man who committed an evil act, I'm able to pray, but I'm still not comfortable with someone else praying or someone else saying a prayer for me. And I think that stems from the fact that here was a man that I was having sex with on Saturday night who would preach about marriage and the sanctity of marriage and prayer on Sunday morning. And so, to be able to...
It must have been a lot of cognitive dissonance, yeah?
It was. And what happened was, at the time, as I said, I was very active in the church. Slowly, because I felt guilty and I felt ashamed, I didn't feel worthy to be teaching Sunday school. I stopped singing in the choir. So that pulling away from church really began during the abusive time. So these men really steal souls. They are thieves. They're thieves of souls. And the church needs to recognize that this isn't just something that victims can get over. It is, in my book, I talk about chapters of spiritual wounds. And I talk about that chapter, how we lose our faith. Our church life is contaminated. We don't ever have that same security and trust that we once had. And it's difficult. And I mourn that loss. I mourn it. I miss having that security in church that I once had. And in some ways, I've thought maybe it's better because I'm more alert to what goes on in churches and that I can be aware, whereas before I wasn't.
Yeah, so that's really tough. I mean, here's a place where you're supposed to be safe, but the exact opposite happened for you, and then now you're alert and you're like watching. I'm like, hey, I'm not 100% sure because one of these is not like the other, and because of so many vulnerable people that are in church, that's where that's where the predators come in. And then for you, I was watching, I like watching scary movies every now and then. I recently watched The Conjuring this past week, and then they were giving the steps for demonic possession. So the first one is infestation, and then it's oppression, and then it's actual possession. So it's like it's this entire 3-step thing where the first infestation is where they start breaking you down and then wearing you down mentally and emotionally. And then oppression, that's where it starts getting worse. And then possession is when your spirit is open, your defenses are down, and that's when you get possessed. But now I'm seeing exactly the same behavior. But the difference is when the last step is you're being preyed upon, whether sexually, mentally, emotionally, physically. Is that the same?
It's a very good analogy. That's an excellent analogy because they need all those steps to continue to hold you in the relationship.
Oh, yes.
Because it's one, and isolation is a huge one.
Oh
He
yes,
separated
isolation.
me
Yeah.
from my friends because the fear of me telling someone, he couldn't have, and he made it very clear that if I were to tell anyone, I would be responsible for what happened to him.
Oh
And
wow.
so, and people say, well, how did you keep that secret for 27 years? Well, when, again, that gaslighting and that I never, ever, the words don't ever tell, never left my psyche. I mean, I knew I could never, ever tell anyone. And especially now, once I had discovered, once people did know, I was thrown out of the church. So
Yeah.
I knew the reaction of people would be to judge me and think differently of me. I mean, really, how bad do you have to be to be thrown out of a church? I mean,
Jeez.
I didn't want that to be known about me, but
Yeah.
it was really a trigger factor, which I talk about in my first chapter, the first book, is that trigger factor that sent me on the edge, that opened me and said, you've got to deal with this. It was,
Yeah.
I had trigger factors throughout my 27 years, and I was able to manage them most of the time. Sometimes they were more difficult than others, because I didn't want anyone to know why I was having this anxiety attack at this moment.
Yeah.
But this particular trigger was not going to go back down. And
Yeah.
I didn't understand why I was having it or what I was going to do with it. But it became pretty clear to me from the beginning I was going to have to deal with my past. And that meant I was going to have to finally reveal my secret.
And that's a very hard secret to bear. So, in the time that the abuse started, did you ever think of saying, "I need to leave"? And then when you've got the courage where you spoke out, and then were unfairly moved out of the church, did you ask, "I need to leave"? And when was that point where you say, "I'm going to speak out against this"?
So I did go to him several times, especially in the beginning, because I wasn't happy in this relationship. This wasn't something
Yeah.
normal. I mean, my friends are doing fun things, and I'm stuck with this married man who is abusive to me, who controlled me. I mean, I was always on edge, wondering, if I was going to get this good person or the one who was mean to me. So I would go to him and, I would say, I feel guilty. I can't do this anymore. He would respond in one of two ways. And of course, his response was based on what he assumed would be the best one for me. So I would say, I can't do this any longer. His first response would be, I need you in the ministry. I can't do this without you. The church needs you. So he played upon the guilt that, I can't leave. And this is what God wants in our lives. Or he would
Wow.
become very angry, because he had hit me before. I always feared he'd hit me. So he would, usually push me against the wall and say to me, you're never going to be able to leave me. Who do you think you are to even think about leaving me?
Jeez.
You're a virgin. No one's going to want you. That's the gaslighting. And there I am against the wall with this bigger man telling me I'm never going to be able to leave. So eventually I just accepted the relationship, because I didn't know how to get out of it. And again, I really believe this would only be over when he said it was over. So once I decided to tell someone, um, I chose my best friend. I didn't want to tell my husband first, even though I knew he'd be supportive. I didn't have that faith and trust, because, again, for 27 years, I kept this in, and I'm about to reveal it. And so it took me almost 20 minutes of just sobbing before I was able to say I was sexually abused by my youth pastor. And that began my healing, because I was able to finally let go of this secret. And I tell victims, secrets aren't good. They don't help you. They only hurt you. Because while I thought I was controlling the secret, for 27 years, that secret was controlling me, because I had to worry about the trigger factors. And every time I thought about the secret or what was a trigger for me, he was back in my life. He really
Yeah.
never left. And so that
Yeah.
abuse continued for 27 years. So being able to tell someone was the beginning. The other thing that I did, I decided early on that if I could find him, I was going to confront him.
Yeah.
I didn't know where he was. I didn't even know if he was alive. So I hired a private investigator, and I found him ministering in a church in Alabama, and I confronted him. And that was healing for me. Wasn't easy. I wasn't sure what I was going to get from it. I knew what I wanted. I wanted him to acknowledge the pain. I wanted him to get what he did to me. He didn't. He wasn't able to do that. But it was powerful for me to be able to look at him after 27 years and say to him, I know what you did and you had no right to do it. And that, it gave me my voice back.
Yeah. So just so to that, so you were thrown out of the church after the 5 years from when.
Like what you're hearing so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking subscribe now button. Follow on YouTube, Instagram, and other platforms listed. Also, check out the website for more information. This podcast is made possible by listeners like you. Thank you for the support. Now back to the show.
The abuse carried on.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
No, I'm saying when was the entire showdown when you let the church know that this is what was happening, and when you were thrown out of the church? When did that happen?
Okay, so that the abuse lasted. So I was 21. It went from 16 to 21.
Yeah.
Two people in the church became suspicious. They followed him one night, and they found us in a hotel room.
Okay.
And then, like I said, he was called into the elders. I was never called in by the elders. I was never asked any questions. I was told not to tell anyone. I was told not to tell my mother. It was all in an effort to protect this pastor and his family so that they could move to the next church. Now, if you know anything about church life, rumors tend to start in churches quite frequently and rapidly.
Quickly. Yes.
So it didn't take long before rumors started flying and people were asking questions. Why was he all of a sudden being, leaving to another church? So he was told that he needed to address the church, and he gave a very vague and very weak confession. Basically, he said, I've sinned against my wife. I've sinned against God. I'm just a man with faults, and I ask your forgiveness. And that was it. 2 days
Where
after,
have I heard that before? I could have sworn.
2 days after that confession, he asked me to meet him in a hotel room. He moved to the next church where once again he committed sexual misconduct. She was in her early 20s. Okay. He'd had a long history. Once I confronted him, he admitted to a long history of sexual misconduct within the church throughout his ministry. They weren't all teenagers, but it was still sexual misconduct within the church. He also told me at the time he had been identified as a sexual addict. Now, his supervisor is sitting in the room, and I was like shocked. I thought, so how does anyone think that this man should be in the ministry?
Of course.
But he continues in ministry. I think he's semi-retired now, but he remains in good standing. And
wow.
I went to his denominational leaders. I traveled to Indianapolis to see his denominational leaders. I wrote to his elders. I did everything I could to express my concerns about this man remaining in ministry, and I was dismissed. I was basically dismissed. Yeah.
That's not very comforting for me from like when we were talking about having the faith in the church and the system of the clergy system, because
and keep in mind he's very charismatic. He is a dynamic speaker. He brings in people, he brings in money. He started out as our youth minister. We went from like 25 kids to over 100 in a very short time. He was then promoted to senior minister. Again, the church just grew in numbers. I say it grew in numbers, but it didn't grow spiritually, because you can't have a spiritual presence when you're being led by an evil individual. And that's what he was. Now, I will also say this wasn't the first time. I wasn't his first victim. Shortly after arriving to our church, a young woman from his first church came forward and accused him of sexual misconduct. My elders at the time and the senior minister confronted him. He said he was sorry. He said it would never happen again. And he promised he would never, ever do that again. 6 months later, he was kissing me in my hallway. Jeez. So people need to understand that these men, most of them are going to repeat this behavior. I mean, it's the facts show that this is a repetitive behavior. And listen, these men, if they're repentant, can be forgiven. They deserve all the love and the grace that God gives to all of us, but they deserve that love and that grace sitting in the third row of the church, not standing in the pulpit. And if they have abused children, they don't belong in the church at all. They do not, they've lost that privilege, and they should never be around children ever again. And I also want to say to church leadership, when it involves a minor, that's against the law. They need to be reported. We don't have a committee meeting. We don't call the elders together. We don't discuss it. You report it to the proper authorities.
Straight to jail. That's what
exactly.
They should be going.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then
that doesn't always happen. That doesn't always happen.
Unfortunately not. I mean, I'm from Johannesburg, South Africa, and 1 in 9 women are either sexually abused or raped, and not a lot of them speak out. And then for those that do speak out, their cases are thrown out of the system. So it's kind of hard for them to go and to speak out. So anytime where justice can be given out, anytime justice can be exacted, I think it should actually be taken, just to send a message. Well, it has to be right, because there are sometimes false accusations of misconduct, and I'm not against that as well. But if the evidence is there and it's something that did happen, something that is truthful, and the person has been victimized, we should definitely just take a stand against it. And I think that's why this keeps on going on. It's because it's not punished. Like, if I can like steal your book and nothing happens to me, I'm gonna keep on doing it, because my behavior is being rewarded. So I think that should happen. And
yeah, and clergy are no different than any other helping profession. So, a doctor, a counselor, a therapist, they have sex with their clients. That's they lose their license. I mean, that is a boundary that you cannot cross. And when you're dealing with hurtful, vulnerable, emotionally unstable people, you don't have a right to take advantage of that instability. A woman who walks into her pastor or clergy or rabbi's office and ask for help should not have her problems compounded by her pastor having sex with her. And I tell, I've also spoken at Cincinnati Christian University. I've been very fortunate that they've allowed me to come and speak to their seminary students.
Yes.
And so one of the things I say to them, because sometimes they'll say, well, what if, the woman comes on to the pastor? Well, here's the thing. First of all, you should know that whether she does or not, you don't cross that boundary no matter what. But even if she does come on to you, as a pastor, as a counselor, you need to see her actions as a cry for help, not an invitation to go to bed. Yeah. I mean, when she's demonstrating that kind of behavior, she's saying to you, I need help. And so many times victims of clergy abuse have been sexually abused prior, either in childhood or prior. Now, that wasn't the case with me, but that's a very common thread. And so when someone comes to a pastor who's already been sexually abused, she's coming trusting him to do the right thing. And so she maybe even try to test him to see, well, every man in my life I've ever been around has always used me sexually, and I'm going to see if he's going to do the same thing. So it's so important for pastors to understand that when you're in that office and you have that power and that authority and the ability to help someone, you need to do that. And you cannot destroy that person by having any kind of intimate relationship with them.
So it's a call for those people in a position to help another individual, not take advantage of them, but be the example that shows that, hey, maybe she's been through so many of these experiences, and now she comes to you for help. And if you do the right thing, who knows, you could probably break the chain. You could just
turn that person's life around.
100%, and then now you want to pray on her instead of praying with her. Right? So Sandy, what was the trigger that you talked about? That it's been 27 years. I've been going through these triggers, some of the church sermons and worship pieces. Now you get to a point where I like to call it the day that turns your life around, where you go through an emotional experience, emotional trigger where you're like, okay, my life has to change. So now I need to go out and confront this, because if I don't, it's going to destroy me. What was that trigger after 27 years?
So as I mentioned, he moved to another church after he left our church. Yeah. And it was, my daughter was playing in a golf tournament in college. Yes. I was driving to this golf tournament, which was in the South, and I happened to pass a sign on the expressway of the town to which he moved after he left our church. And I saw that the name of the city And I felt his presence in the car. I felt everything about him surrounding me. I started to really lose control. So I pulled to the side of the road and got out of my car and just sat next to my car and sobbed for probably a half hour. I didn't know why I was feeling this way. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. And I finally pulled myself together enough to continue on with the trip and to watch my daughter play golf. And then I got home, and for 2 weeks, I was a mess. I couldn't function. I walked around the house wringing my hands because I didn't know what to do. And the thought of ever telling anyone just terrified me. It terrified me because the other thing, here I was 49 years old at the time, and I'm thinking, if I tell someone, I'm going to get in trouble because that's what happened when someone did know back when the church found. But
so
I also had this
came back.
And I also had this fear of him. I had this fear that if I tell someone, he's going to find me and I'm going to be in trouble. So I had to, really, really work hard to do to a point where I could say to someone that I was sexually abused by my pastor. And then when I hired their private investigator, I went with my friend. We're sitting in the office. And his secretary says to me, so who is it we're looking for? And I could not say his name because I thought, I can't tell them who this is. And at that moment, had my friend not been with me, I would have left. I wouldn't have stayed. I would have thought, this isn't worth it. I can't do it. So I tell victims, I totally and completely understand how hard it is to tell someone. But you cannot heal, you cannot move forward if you harbor this secret, because that person is still abusing you in an emotional way years after the physical abuse has ended. So as difficult as it is to tell someone, that's what you need to do. And I recommend that they find someone outside of the church, because chances are that person in the church is going to have a kind of relationship with that pastor as well. So it's probably better to find someone that you can trust outside of the church to first tell your story to. But it's vital. It's so vital to be able to tell, and it's freeing. I sit here very calmly telling my story, but for 2 or 3 years, I sobbed every time I told my story. But that healing began. And again, I started to understand that my story had an impact on others, and it was important that I tell my story.
So, like, with what ended up happening to you with this experience, did that have an impact on being able to be intimate with any other men, or especially you getting married in a relationship with your husband? Did that impact you in any kind of way?
Well, in the beginning, right after the relationship ended, I had a very low self-esteem. I didn't think, I really just saw myself as just worthless. And so any encounter that I had with any other men became sexual pretty quickly, just because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. That's how my worth was valued. And that was what I believed. And so, I was promiscuous, I would say, early on. Then I met my husband, who was not going down that path and who treated me with respect and dignity and showed me that love did not necessarily mean that I had to be physical. I fell in love with him almost immediately. And so initially, I think I worried in the beginning how I would be with him sexually. But it flowed very naturally because he loved me. And it was a relationship and a sexual relationship out of love and respect. And so they were so totally different than what I had experienced. My abuser was violent with me. It was very much sex and then it was over. He was never affectionate with me. And so having my husband, who showed me what respect and love could be, totally changed how I responded. And so it wasn't an issue, although I've talked to many victims where it is an issue and that they have difficulty being intimate with their spouse. So I was very fortunate that wasn't a major problem for me.
Yeah, so that's amazing, because some victims will be like, I can't just even be around people who even remind me of that entire situation. But you were blessed enough to At least find a man who
And I give,
loves you for who you are.
again, I give credit to my husband on that. And I also think I was raised in a way with my own parents to know that what was happening to me during that abusive time, that really wasn't love. I mean,
Yeah.
I understood that he wasn't giving me gifts. He never said anything nice that was, he always accused me of being too fat, or I didn't wear this right kind of dress. I mean, it was always critical. And the moments that I would get where I was sobbing or saying, why are you so mean to me? He would turn it on to say, I love you. And that was gaslighting. When I was writing the book, I found this very interesting. I was writing the book and I would come to his conversation with him and he would say, I love you. And then, chapter 2 later, he would write, I love you. And I stopped for a moment and I thought, did he ever say that he loved me? He always said, I love you. And that was the gaslighting. And it was, I never recognized that until I started writing the book. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, I keep repeating this. Is that what he really? And I thought, you know what? He never did say it. He never said he loved me. He always said, well, I love you. I love you.
Yeah.
To a point where I felt, well, I believe that he does because he's telling me he does.
Well, he didn't tell you. Oh, wow.
So,
the
there's
psychological gymnastics.
It is. And part of the abuse, and many victims will identify with this, they have to keep you in this limbo and this constant back and forth, because it's the only, if you ever get on balance and then you're able to look at the things the way they are, but it is a yo-yo back and forth of emotion. Just you walk on eggshells, because I never knew if he was going to be kind in some way or he was going to be angry at me. And there were many times he would say to me, I'm mad at you. And I'd say, well, what did I do? Well, you know what you did. No, I don't. And I knew there was no point in trying to figure it out because it didn't matter. The point was he was mad at me. And then eventually he would be over it. And I never knew what it was. And he needed to do that to keep me in line.
Right. Wow. So that's psychopathic behavior, I must say.
Well, exactly. They know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing.
So in your journey to like speaking to females and people who have gone through this entire harrowing experience, first question is, what was your darkest moment while you were going through this abusive situation? And then have you come across someone else who's had like a similar dark moment? If you could share that.
I think the darkest moment for me was the moment I gave up and said, I'm never going to be out of this relationship. I remember the night that I felt that he had just had sex with his wife and was telling me how great it was. And I sat there and thought, I don't know what to do with that. And because I don't know what to do with that, this is it. This is my life. And I just gave up and just accepted it. And that was probably the darkest moment for me, when I gave up, when I just finally gave up. And I think victims, when they've been in a relationship that is abusive like that, and again, mine was 5 years. So there was no way out for me. Other victims express that same feeling of hopelessness, because the other thing we feel is we feel alone. We don't believe anyone else has gone through this. Mine was before the internet and Oprah and any, all of the information we have. But even with information, victims will say, but I didn't feel like it was in my same situation, or it wasn't like what was happening to me. We really still believe that this is happening to no one else, and no one else is going to understand if we try to tell anyone. And so we feel very alone and very isolated. The other thing is, and this may be hard for people to understand, there's a certain obligation that abuse victims feel toward their perpetrators. So especially young children will feel this, well, he gives me gifts and he always takes me to the park. And so I don't want to tell on him. As I got older, as people get older, like for my instance, I felt this obligation because he had been so good to me in the beginning and helped me with dealing with my parents' divorce and put me in these positions of leadership in the church and made me feel special. And so there's a feeling of obligation to our perpetrators, because I also knew that if I were to tell on him, I knew enough that this would be a bombshell, not only for him, but to the entire congregation. And did I want to be responsible for these people finding out that the person that they think practically walks on water and who has done all these wonderful things in the church, that I am now going to destroy that illusion. I mean, that would be a burden I didn't want either. So there's so many factors that go into why we feel so trapped and how we feel like we can't get out of it. So that dark moment was certainly that moment I felt like I had no way where to go.
Mm. That's absolutely amazing. So as part of your healing, you decided to start speaking out, and then you engaged on a very difficult task of putting a book together. So how did that journey play out?
Well, I had been doing speaking engagements, as you mentioned, and speaking at conferences. And so many times people would say to me after my story, "Oh, you need to write a book." Well,
yeah,
I had no intentions of writing a book. I've never been a writer. It wasn't something I had a burning desire to do. But I two things happened. I became frustrated by the number of incidences I was learning about of these pastors who were being returned to the ministry. I was frustrated by church leadership saying, well, God forgives us, so we should forgive him, or it's not our place to judge. So I was very frustrated by the reaction within the church and church leadership. And the second reason I wrote it was, again, as I mentioned earlier, I just felt, my story could help someone else. If I had heard someone else's story when this was happening to me, maybe my life would have turned out a little bit differently. So I knew that my story could have an impact. And that was the reason I wrote the book. It was a difficult write at times. There were times I had to stop writing to give myself a break, because it's one thing to stand up in front of a group and say, I was sexually abused by my youth pastor. It went on for 5 years. It's a little different to talk about details and to, give examples and talk about, the time that he called me out of choir and said he had to see me for a minute in his office. The choir director excused me. I went into his office. He bent me over the desk and had sex with me, sent me back to choir where I sat next to his wife. To relive that on written paper was difficult. And there's many instances like that in the book. And that was difficult. But I also understood I couldn't write a book and just say I was sexually abused. The impact had to be the details. And I tried to do it in such a way that it wasn't salacious and just for the sheer shock value. But that's what made the book so difficult to write. But having said that, it also was cathartic because I finally got it all out. And what it said to me is I was 16 years old and I have nothing to be ashamed of. I have nothing to be ashamed of. There are many things in the book that are embarrassing, but I'm not ashamed of those things because what was done to me was wrong and it should never have happened. It should never have happened.
It should never have happened. And like, my gosh, man, you were a child. I mean, 16, you're a child. Some people are 35 and still children, but you know what I mean? Like you were a child, you were innocent.
And I think that was part of the problem for me in the sense how the church responded, because I was 21 when it ended, and he called me after he was in with the elders and said, I need you to tell them that if they ask you, you tell them this has only been going on a year. So, and they never did ask me, but had they asked me, I would have done exactly what he told me to do. And that would have been to lie and say, no, this started when I was 20. And I think he did that for two reasons. One, I don't think he obviously wanted them to know I was 16 when he first kissed me. But the second thing was he was at our church for 5 years. So he had to look at them and say, the entire time of this ministry that I've been here, I've been having sex with this person. Yes. And so it's yes. And it's easier to be forgiven for saying I made a mistake and it was a year, other than it's been going on for 5 years. It made it a little more difficult for them to accept. And so, the narrative that they got was not the truth. It was not accurate. Now, and I also decided that not only did I want to confront my abuser, but I went back to the church where this happened and asked for a meeting of the current elders. And none of them were in position at the time. And I wasn't looking to blame them, but I also wanted an acknowledgement from them that what was done to me at that time was wrong. And that I wanted to be welcome back in that church, whether I'd ever go back there or not. But, and they were very gracious. They were very willing to do that. Some of the people were there at the time and remembered the sexual abuse. I think at the time they saw it as an affair. They didn't see it as sexual abuse. But I having to confront the current elders, and I don't say confront because they allowed me to have the meeting, was very instrumental in my healing. And I will be always grateful for them to allow me to come and tell the truth, which they didn't know 27 years earlier. And that truth needed to be told now.
Yeah, 100%. They say the truth shall set you free, but only once it's done with you. So this is a question. With any of these encounters, were any of those against your will? Or
Say that again.
With any of the encounters, were they all against your will? Such as
After the sexual abuse with my pastor?
No. Like during the entire thing.
Oh, well, sure. There were several times where, yes, it was just a physical, he was going to have sex with me, whether I wanted it or not.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yes. That wasn't a lot of times. I don't want to give the impression, but there were times, yes, and I'll give a tease to the book, but there was an incident in particular that I was emotionally distraught, and he dismissed that, and he was going to have sex with me because he wanted to have sex with me.
Jesus.
Yeah.
So you're just taking your entire power away. So, so then, like, your husband is the MVP. He's the most valuable player.
Yes. He's number 40. He's number 40 in the book. And there's a reason for that, but he's number 40. Not number 40. Don't get it in the wrong way, but there's a reason. Yeah.
Isn't 40 like it's a very important number in the Bible, that's what I read. But anyway, he's the MVP because
yes.
For him to embrace you the way he's embraced you, made you feel the way that you felt, and then obviously when this came out, he didn't just pack up his bags and say, "I'm out." He stayed and he supported you. So how did he support you once you said, "Listen, honey, this is what happened, and this is how it came across"? How was that interaction like, and how did he support you throughout going forward from once the secret was revealed?
Well, the first thing, he was very kind and loving. He didn't judge me. I actually called him one day and said, let's meet for dinner one night. And I went to his office, and I was just a mess trying to tell him what had happened to me. I think his first concern was how this affected me and where I was going to go forward. And when I told him that I wanted to confront my abuser, he was cautious about that because he was afraid of how that would affect me. He was worried that I would have expectations that this was not going to be what I hoped would happen. So that was his first concern, was, where I was emotionally with this. Then he said to me, "Sandy, no one can know what this feels like. No one knows what you're going through, and only you can decide what you need to do. And so whatever it is you think you need to do, I will support you." Now, I think when I wrote the book, he was concerned, not for himself and what I was revealing in the book. I think he was concerned about my grandchildren reading it someday. But, I explained to him, I said, when they read this and they're old enough to read it, I hope they see that this was an event. This was not an event. This was something that was done to me, and that I came through it, and I came through it as a strong person, and I was courageous enough to overcome. And that's what I hope the lesson they would get from it. But as far as supporting me throughout, he was always just, it was whatever I thought I needed to do. And the other gift that he gave me, he said to me, "You only share what you want to share with me. I don't need to know any more than you need to tell me." And that was a huge relief to me. Because again, even though I knew what was done to me was wrong and it wasn't my fault, it still was embarrassing to have to share some things that I didn't want to have to share. So yeah, but I tell people, if you don't have that spouse, you need to find a support person. There are people who will support you and be your support. And it's vital to have that person in your corner, because it's tough to go through this alone. And healing is difficult. You take 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's a process that takes a lot of time. And I encourage victims that you're not going to feel like you're going to make it some days.
Yeah.
But each day gets better, and you will make it with work. Yeah. And I go back to, you've got to tell somebody, and then you've got to educate yourself. You find everything you can, whether it's even abuse, whether it's clergy or not, because abuse is horrific no matter, the clergy just adds another dimension to it.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, on your path to you being healed, and the shout out to the MVP for being a good example of what men should be, because we have a shortage of good men out there. And he's an example of what a good man would do in such a situation. So shout out to him, the MVP. So on your path to healing, what was the most helpful thing outside of your support group and you speaking out? What was the thing that, just
this may sound surprising, but I was finally able to forgive him. Now, let me clarify what I mean by forgiving. I call it unburdening myself. I was going to let go of this man who was still controlling my life, because for 27 years, I carried guilt and shame. And then after I was able to speak out and finally talk about my abuse, then I was carrying anger and resentment.
Yeah.
And I was angry that this man still remained in ministry. I was angry that he was going to really, no consequences were going to happen because of what he had done to me and to other women.
Yes.
And so I carried that with me. And what I was finally discovering was I was channeling all this anger and frustration, and nothing was changing. I would wake up in the morning and be angry. And I think, I bet he wakes up in the morning and he's having a good day. My anger and frustration was doing nothing to him.
Yeah.
It was doing everything. It was just, I couldn't enjoy my family. I couldn't enjoy my life. I wanted to live the life that I was meant to live and not the one that he created. And as long as I held on to this anger and resentment, I had to. Now, forgiveness doesn't mean I forget. It doesn't mean I remain silent.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that I condone that behavior. But what it meant for me was, how can I channel that into something else? And so for me, it was, I've started volunteering for the Hope of Survivors Ministry. I began speaking to other victims. That's how I channeled it. I gave up trying to change church structure.
Yeah.
I can't do that. I can tell my story. If someone wants to listen, that's great. But I channel my mission and my ministry toward helping other victims and telling my story. So it was a matter, and now I say again, it wasn't easy to do. It was 2 years before I finally was able to let go. So it's an unburdening. It's really just unburdening yourself and saying, I'm not going to let this person be in my life, because as long as I was thinking about him, he was still in my life, and I didn't want him in my life any longer. So that was my biggest probably aha moment, to finally be able to say, you know what? I don't care what he's doing. I don't care what's going on in his life, because I'm living my life.
So what do you say to those who don't want to, not don't want to, having a hard time getting to the place where you say, I'm going to let go of what happened. I'm not going to forget. I'm not going to say it's okay. I'm going to carry on speaking out, but I'm not going to let what happened have the power over me. Some people it's really difficult. They don't have the strength to sort of forgive. What do you say to a person who is harboring that unforgiveness?
Well, first I would say it's an exercise. I mean, that moment that you feel that anger, it's almost like a physical exercise. You have to make yourself stop and say, for me, it was, I'm going to stop and I'm going to find something else. I'm not going to think about it now. That was an exercise that each time I would do it, it got a little bit easier. And I guess for me, I was tired. I was tired of the anger. I was tired of it. And I wanted to live my life, and I couldn't do that. And so I think it's a decision you have to make. It's an actual decision. I'm no longer going to do this. And it wasn't helpful to me. And again, I think it's a difficult thing to do, but it's worthwhile to make that effort to try and do it. It just wasn't serving its purpose for me. It didn't help me. And so I said, I'm done with it. I got to figure out how to do something else. And, that's not to say that there aren't times when I think, I can't believe he's still in the ministry, and I get a little upset and angry. There's justifiable anger. It's not like I just, say, oh, well, whatever. I mean, there is justifiable anger.
Yes.
But what I discovered is nothing was going to change. my anger wasn't changing anything. And that's sort of how I let go of it. But it's a conscience. You got to think about it and say, I'm going to make my mind up that I've got to figure out a way to do this. I think it's an unknown, the quote's unknown as far as who said it, but they said resentment and anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Yeah. I think that was T.D. Jakes who said that.
Was it? I never could find it. So, but I think it's a great example. It's perfect. It eats away at you from the inside out, and really destroys your life.
Yeah. So what do you, like you said, you had conversations with seminary students about your experience and what they should be aware of. What do you say to those, especially myself, when we were talking before the recording, is you're seeing all these things in the church and the ministry that you don't agree with. Many people are stealing, many people are being guilty of sexual abuse, and then things are not progressing. Those people who say, I don't want to touch the ministry, I don't want to touch church. What do you say to people who've gotten to that point where they're like, I'm very skeptical of what's going on there, I'm just going to distance myself? What do you say to that?
Well, I would say first, it's probably understandable because there is, as you say, many things we see within the church walls that do not represent a Christian life or what God would want in that. So I think it's understandable. But as I said earlier, there are pastors and there are churches that are making the effort to do the right thing. Certainly being in the ministry is not for everyone. And if it's not your calling, then you shouldn't be there. And I think that's where some of these men, they go into the ministry for the wrong reasons, and they find themselves in a powerful position and they like the attention. And that's what drives them, not the biblical aspect of it per se. Yeah. They like being in charge. They like having control. There's an excellent book called The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse. It was one of the first books that I read that explained how these men sometimes can get in these positions, and they use that spiritual, their education, they use their guidance as a weapon against the people in their church, almost as an emotional weapon. Yeah, I don't think it's for everyone. And I think people need to evaluate their ministers when they hire them, to see if this is someone who is going to be a fit for their pastor, to be in the ministry.
Yeah, that's very important. And so I know that the biggest story that came out about, sexual abuse happened in the Catholic Church, with all those stories that were happening there. But you said you didn't come from a Catholic church. So it was like, what else? Was it a charismatic church? What
it's a Christian church, Church of Christ. It's kind of an, someone we might describe as evangelical. Okay. Sometime to the Baptist church. The difference with a Catholic church is that most of the victims, not all, and many are not, are young boys and young girls. Is the churches in different denominations, there tends to be teenage girls and women in the church. And I think, the Catholic Church, their major fault in the beginning was the cover up. I mean, no one, and I'd say this to church leaders, no one faults you for the first time that someone in your church is found to have committed sexual misconduct. It's what you do with it that you are judged by. And in my case, again, they knew of an incident prior to coming to our church, and they kept it from the congregation. They didn't, and not only did they keep it in the congregation, they probably should have fired the guy on the spot to say, 100%. This is something, but the fact that they too swept it under the rug. And churches will say, well, their reasoning is we don't want to embarrass the church and we don't want people to think bad of the church. They only think bad of the church when they find out you've swept it under the rug and that you continue to support these perpetrators. That's what they're judging you on. And once you're aware of one instance, you might say, well, we didn't have any idea and we had no clue that this man had this in his background. But once you're aware, you can no longer use that as an excuse. You now know. And again, I became collateral damage so that this man could keep his job, basically. That's what they were saying. Okay, we forgive you. We're, you say you're sorry you did this. We're like to continue as a minister in our church. And therefore, I became another victim. I became collateral damage so this man could keep his job. And I don't think that's God's intention,
You became a scapegoat.
Exactly. And basically, and basically, whether they were saying it outright, what they were saying was, we're willing to risk any teenage girl in this church so that he can keep his job.
100%.
And they don't have a right to do that. They don't have a right to do that.
Yeah.
And churches still do that.
Accomplice, yeah.
Yeah, they still continue to, and again, churches go back to, well, we can't judge and we should be forgiving him because we're forgiven. But we're not judging his soul. We're judging whether he's capable of doing his job. That's what you're judging.
Yeah.
And again, you can forgive that person, but it's not just about a moral fall here. It is about a moral professional violation. They have violated the ethics of their profession, and that's why they are no longer fit to be in the ministry. If the moral aspect of it, the church can deal with it all they want. They can forgive him. They can give him counseling, whatever they want to do. But professionally, he's lost that privilege of ministry.
100%. And the action needs to be taken for that, because once someone finds out that, this was a cover up, you set it under the rug and you put other people's lives and basically souls in danger, we're going to be like, no, I'm going to distance myself. I'm not too sure that I want to go there, or my children should go there, because who knows if they're going to be a victim of abuse because you let it happen.
And it's not about, necessary punishment, It's about the integrity and safety of the church. You don't allow these men in the church because you want to have the integrity of the church and you want to have safety. And you can't have either one of those when you have allowed a man who has proven by his own actions that he's not fit for the ministry.
100%. 100%. You should deal with them. So where, Sandy Phillips Kirkham, aka Strong Woman, where can we get a copy of your book?
Well, let me show you the title. This is the title. It's Let Me Pray Upon You. It's available on Amazon. Okay. It's also available on my website, which is just my name, www.sandyphillipskirkham.com. I would also say to victims, there's a lot of good information on my website. I would also recommend the Hope of Survivors website. Great resource for victims and for church leadership. And then in the back of my book, there's resources for victims and church leadership as well, because education is going to be the key to a lot of this. Because if we don't understand clergy sexual abuse and how it happens and why it happens and how we should handle it, we are never going to be able to respond appropriately to it and respond lovingly and caringly to the victims as well.
100%. So is it only on physical copy, or is there an ebook available?
There's an ebook available. It's not on audio, but there's an ebook available as well on Amazon.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Guess what I'm reading tonight? Yes, and gifting it to some of my colleagues that I know. So as we go to the conclusion of this, there's also something that I'm not necessarily sure that I should bring about, because I don't think it applies, but I'll just ask anyway. Is the racial and cultural divide of abuse, because I know that, for example, you being a Caucasian woman might go through this experience. You'll think, oh no, it's only me and people who look like me who go through this. However, as I can tell you, as a Black African and as I've heard, this happens to us as well. So what about a person who says, is this actually cross-cultural? Does it happen across races, cultures, and creeds? Does this type of abuse happen to everybody, so that they can be like, she's Sandy, she looks different from me, maybe her experience is different, so her story is different to mine, so my story is not going to be validated. So does this advice that you give apply to you?
My message goes across, and the thing is these perpetrators, regardless of their background, their color of their skin, they all have the same playbook. They're all using the same
hymn book, they say.
Yes, exactly. They're using, the grooming, the manipulation, the isolation, the gaslight. They target vulnerable people. So it doesn't matter what color your skin is. If you're vulnerable, you can be a target to these men. And I always say they have a sixth sense. They know how to pick out the people who are going to be so easily trapped by them. So, yes, my story is different. I'm a suburban white woman living in the United States, but my experience will resonate with other victims. And I've seen that, like I said, when I've counseled victims, we're all amazed. We're all amazed at how similar our stories are in the sense. So many of them said, oh my gosh, he said the same thing, that he was like David in the Bible. That's a classic. They all use that.
They should leave David alone. David was messed up, but okay.
But that they love being the example of David. That's just their, that's their thing. And the other one is don't lean on your own understanding. So that we're supposed to listen to him because he's more spiritual and he knows more. I mean, we all sit there and say, oh yeah, he said that to me too. So, and not to be light and funny about it, but they've got a playbook that they use. So while how we respond to our trauma can be different because of our past experiences, the actual abuse has so many similarities that it's frightening, really. It's frightening.
So what were some of the most, now that you look at it retrospectively and on this journey that you've been on, what are some of the most ridiculous things that you heard about this entire thing? For example, like David from the Bible and, stuff like that. What are some of the more ridiculous things? That was a complete lie.
Yeah. Right. Well, he said we were married in God's eyes. That was another one, that we were married. I couldn't figure that one out. From the other standpoint of, it's not ridiculous as much, but then church members would say to me, well, look at all the good he's done.
Oh, wow.
And I would think, well, that's because you saw that side of him, but you didn't see him through the week when I saw him. And so that was always, I wanted to think, and the bottom line is, this isn't about, we get scales, like he did this many good things and he did this bad thing, so this outweigh. That's not what this is about. It doesn't matter how many good things and the good things are done as a disguise anyway. He has to pretend like he's a good person so that he can fool everyone in the congregation. So I don't know if I quite answered your question, but I'm sure I'll think of a few more things after we're finished.
That's fine. All right, cool. So, Sandy, that's one of the most, the hardest things is for someone who had faith in a person, for that faith to be shattered. And then for a person to hear your story and to be like saying there's a lot of, this is unjust. So for a person whose entire world has just collapsed because they looked up to this person, they are a symbol of goodness and greatness, and then that person has fallen down, and then they see your story and say, well, actually the people are actually being hurt. How can you get that person's views to be more balanced so that they don't have this, what do they call this? Have a God complex to people who are actually scum sometimes, and then to be able to validate your story to like, okay, Sandy actually went through some dreadful stuff, even though she's not as prominent as the perpetrator. How do we get people to kind of see the balance? And
well, I think the first key, is that you understand that, it wasn't your fault, and you have to have that self-worth and that shame and that guilt that you're carrying needs to let go of that, because you have nothing to feel guilty and ashamed about. And then for me, I came to the conclusion, I began to understand that God had nothing to do with this, And so when people say to me, well, God had a purpose, God had a reason. No, he didn't. He wept for me, for the pain that I was going through. This was not God. That one. Yes, I've used it for a good purpose, and I've taken that pain and trauma and funneled it into a good place. But that's not because God said, "Oh, I want this to happen to her so she can do this later in life." And the other thing I say about that is, God's a pretty big God. If you believe in God, he understands if you have your doubts. And I've had a victim say to me, I don't believe in God anymore. And I said, I understand that. And God understands that because of what you've been through. You cannot, people who've been sexually abused within the church and by a pastor or a priest or a rabbi, it can destroy your faith in God and belief in God. And that's okay at the moment. And if you can get back there, then you do that. But you don't. I think victims try to rush themselves into thinking, oh, I was a spiritual person before this happened, and now I got to get back to where I was. It changes you. abuse, whether it's in the church or not, it changes a person. Now, and I'll say this to victims, and maybe this can be our last, hope for victims, but your abuse will always be a part of your life, but it doesn't have to define your life. It doesn't
100%.
have to say who you are. And that takes time. But as abuse victims, we feel like this is who we are. And that's not the truth. The truth is you are a unique, wonderful individual who can find her way back or his way back. And that's my hope, that you will. And I pray that will be a part of your life someday, that you can say it happened, but it's not who I am.
Yes, 100%. Amen. We'll go with that.
That's right.
So thank you. So thank you very much, Sandy Phillips Kirkham, aka Strong Woman, who's married.
I love you. You are great. Thank you.
The most valuable player. What's your husband's name?
His name is Bill.
Bill.
Yes.
Hey,
Yes.
Bill, the most valuable player. So, ladies and gentlemen, that has been Sandy Phillips Kirkham, aka Strong Woman, and she has just been absolutely fantastic and vulnerable and very authoritative in sharing a story of sexual abuse within the clergy. And hopefully, you've gotten a lot of lessons to how you can identify your predatory behaviors. And it's okay that you've gone through this experience, and that it's okay for you to speak out, and it's okay for you to seek out help.
Right.
Be angry, be frustrated, but at least attack that what happened, and face the truth, so that you can use that pain to a positive result. And you can find her at www.sandyphillipskirkham.com, and where you can get her book, which is "Let Me Pray Upon You." Very, very interesting book based on the cover that I've seen, and it's definitely life-changing and transformative. And so then on the show notes, I'll share where they can find you, where they can connect with you, and hopefully you got this a lot of value from this. And remember, family out there, that success is a progressive realization of a worthy ideal. That means you're going after what you've always wanted to go after, and is aligned with the highest values, and that is the only way for you to live a truly fulfilled and successful life. So go out there and change the world, because you're the only person that can. Thank you very much, Sandy.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode on the NJ Podcast. Make sure to visit the website, the njpodcast.captivateair.fm, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Stitcher, all the other podcast platforms, or via RSS, so you never miss a show. You can also find the video content on the YouTube channel and Instagram page. That will be Njabulo James on YouTube and njabulo.j.ngosi for Instagram. Please subscribe and follow on those platforms as well. And while you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating on the podcast platforms, or if you'd like to tell a friend about the show, that will help us out too. If you'd like more information about published or upcoming books, visit www.njabulojames.com for more information. Please reach out if you would like to share what you would like to hear and which guests should be invited to the show. And remember, success is a progressive realization of a worthy ideal, which means that you are doing what you have always wanted to do because it is aligned with your highest values, and this is the only way you can live a truly fulfilled life. Now just chill until the next episode.